Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. I am so glad to be here with you tonight. My name is Alfred Day. I'm an Associate Dean of Students and Director of the Center for Support and Intervention at the University of California, Berkeley. And I am here happily representing a group called GeekED. That is the folks who are involved in higher education and pop culture. We have been associated and presenting with Comic-Con for 10 years now. And we are really happy to be with you today to talk about Lovecraft Country. If you're not familiar with Lovecraft Country, we're going to talk about the show, which is a horror drama on HBO, produced by Misha Green, based on the book by Matt Ruff. And we're really, really happy to talk with you tonight about Lovecraft Country and its levels and levels of meaning. And I'm going to allow everyone in this group to introduce themselves. And to start out in your introduction, if you could share who you are, the pronouns you use. I use he, him, and his. And sort of what character were you drawn to or resonated with, or even what character really made you mad? For me, that could be the same character. But why don't I throw it to you, Jada, and you can tell us a little bit about your connection with it.
Yeah, thanks, Al. Hi, I'm Jada Anderson, pronoun she, her, hers. I am currently an assistant resident director at UCLA, but I'm heading on out to grad school to University of Maryland College Park. So I guess go Bruins, but go Terps more now. I was a huge fan of the TV series Lovecraft Country, so much so that it actually made me read the book, got me back into reading. But I think my favorite character, I love all the women in the show, but Hippolyta was my absolute favorite, and the episode that was Hippolyta centric just really moved me. I think I've watched it like 10 times at this point. But I like Hippolyta as this huge emblem of what's called the enduring woman, which is like, traditional horror, we have the final girl who we usually think of as like Sigourney Weaver from Alien. But the enduring woman is like a Black woman who, even after being the hero, saves the day, which pretty much all the women are, but Hippolyta stands out as one. They still have to go back to the world of misogynoir and the racism that they face, the sexism they face. And with Hippolyta, has to take care of D and take care of business. So I think she really represents that super well. And yeah, I just love her.
How about you, David?
Hi, everyone. David Surratt, he, him pronouns. I am Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students at the University of Oklahoma. Jada stole my answer. So Hippolyta was my person. But, I was really a fan of Uncle George, too. So I just really appreciate actually their relationship and who they were as people. Gosh. You stole it, Jada. I think that's right on. Hippolyta was awesome. So I'm just going to go with my original answer. I think I was also really captivated at just how out of all the characters, because there were so many different dynamics and flaws and anxiety and pain and all these different things. Hippolyta can continue to ring true to me as one of the most consistent characters who was thoughtful, logical, and made some of the most important and reasonable decisions that I felt based and motivated out of the right motivations throughout the show. So that I'm gonna stick with Hippolyta there. So I'm gonna turn it over to Andrea.
Thanks so much for having me on this panel. I'm so excited to talk about all these topics. My name is Drea Letamendi. I am a clinical psychologist and the interim director of resilience at UCLA. I would say that the character that stood out during the show for me was Ruby. And the reason that I was always drawn to Ruby is that she was the character who was just remarkably bold and then written in a way that made us uncomfortable and made us realize where the mistakes are in terms of handling and dealing with incredibly complex racial and gender issues. In particular, her alignment with whiteness and her curiosity around what it would be like to let go of Blackness. And if you're a BIPOC person, that is always something that we think about is, what are the costs for me if I'm aligning to this institutional, this social, this cultural mainstream, values and beliefs? What am I losing about my own self every time that I do that? And I think for her, this is a character, they were willing to be really frank and direct about it. She made mistakes, but she also did things that I think we can understand and relate to. And I appreciated those steps. It made us see that not everybody on this show uh, took these ideas in the same way, that everybody had different experiences and motivations here, and hers is one that I really related to. So I'd say that she's a character that continues to stand out, and she had her fate. It's a really interesting lesson.
Drea, it's as you talk about Ruby, I loved Ruby so much, and I just to pick a favorite is so difficult. And I'm almost glad you said Ruby, because it leaves the pressure for me to say Ruby, because I love Ruby. And so it leaves me to speak about Letitia F. and Lewis, who I just adored from the moment she appeared on the screen, and who made her mistakes too, and who sort of had to come to terms with a lot of things. And I resonated with her ambivalence, sort of active ambivalence around religion, particularly within the context of the Black community. And there was very few characters I didn't respond to. I mentioned earlier, one of the interesting things about it is I would also say Tick was a character, one of my favorite characters, except Tick really did some messed up stuff. And that's sort of leads me to my next question for discussion, which is, we have talked before in our panels about the importance of representation and the importance of us having characters of color to represent us, particularly in heroic fiction. And in Lovecraft Country, we definitely had characters who acted in the traditional heroic roles, but almost to a person. And I can't think of really any character that didn't have this. These were very complex characters who often did really jacked up, horrible things. What does it mean? Is it a sign of progress, or is it not, to have lead characters of color who are sometimes doing unlikable or downright evil things? I'm thinking of the things that Tick did. I'm thinking of the things that George did. I'm really thinking of the things that Tick's dad did, who did some real awful stuff, both I think intentionally meant to be horrible within the context of the show, and struck me as horrible outside the context of the show. What does it mean to have representation, but those characters aren't necessarily doing 100% noble and good things?
Yeah, Montrose had a lot. He was dealing with a lot, for sure. And we could probably get into that too in more depth.
Oh, totally. I literally, like, throughout the series, throughout each week, I was like, Montrose needs therapy the most out of all of them. Like, he needs the most help. But as you said, Al, like, I feel like I noticed, like, it really hit that all of our characters were deeply flawed in the episode where they all were just leaving Dee to fend for herself against the Pickaninnies. And she was, like, in this horrible situation, and no one was helping. Hippolyta was missing because she'd finally chosen herself for once, and it was like, wow, look what happens, one, when the matriarch is removed from the equation, and two, all these people are so driven by their own interests at this point. But I thought that was like really awesome, in that it was just like, okay, in so many shows, like, as audience members, the thing that is focused on is like our characters, like our Black characters, being written sort of like in this really tiptoey, like, careful way, where it's like they talk about racism, or they're like the sidekick to the best friend. They're educating people. They can't say things too controversial, because then, like, we're going to be called racist because we made them, like, do controversial things. And I felt like Lovecraft Country really raised the bar for a lot of shows and for viewership. Like, I think it just increased, I think for me and a lot of people, like, we had to really, like, consider what we were consuming, and like really our media literacy had to grow and like become more sharp, because we were like, oh, we can't just have characters who are like, it's all about them being Black. Like these were our characters who were Black, going through things. The biggest monster in the story was racism, but they were also getting in their own way, sabotaging each other, like being really awful to each other, being super homophobic, in internal and external ways. And I think that just opened the door for like other shows and just like other media as well to be like, okay, like we can't just keep writing these characters so one-dimensionally and everything is about their race or everything is about like their one identity. We have to push them to do like these really hard things. And I think for us, it made them more relatable. Like, oh, that was awful, but like I probably would have done the same thing like in that situation.
Yeah, I think I felt like we got a hint of that at the beginning, right? When we open up with the scene and you have Tick on the bus, right? He's talking about the book he's reading, right? And he says, stories are like people, loving them doesn't make them perfect, but you have to cherish them and overlook their flaws, right? I hope I quoted that right. But I remember when I rewatched Lovecraft Country, I caught that the second time. I didn't catch it the first time. And had I been paying attention, you're right, it leads up into all these different ways in which we look at these characters and we know that we have to think about this in much more nuanced ways, which I really appreciated about the complexity of the storytelling.
I absolutely agree. There's a lens of trauma. I mean, obviously this is in the horror genre, so the brutality and the violence is it has a huge impact. It's really super elevated. It's meant to, my experience of the show is that it's meant to make you uncomfortable. It takes the sacred and makes that grotesque. It takes what people don't talk about and puts it right in your face. That directness, that frankness comes with, I think, the additional context of now what are you left with to think about? What are you reckoning with now that you have all of this together? And this, I think, let me just make a contrast to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where they did deal with race. The writing did pull in racism as Sam was dealing with it. And I'm not saying one approach is better than the other, but what I would say about that is there are some times where that show fell flat because it gave you the experience of trauma. The police showing up out of nowhere, that lone scene, just this sense of invisibility for Sam, but not a ton of attention to the aftermath of those experiences. A show like this is really, really steeped in those complex and, as David's saying, these nuances that really kind of force you to have a deeper and more complex consideration of these issues. And I'd also say that I just have to mention that the time that this show aired was right after our Cruel Summer. So, if we remember that episode about Emmett Till with that Cruel Summer song and the juxtaposition between the funeral and then this pop music, that was meant to be, in my mind, that was meant to be really eerie and misplaced. That was meant to make us feel alone in this trauma. And our Cruel Summer was the killing of George Floyd. And similarly, many people felt very sort of alone in that trauma, in that other people were not quite as there yet with witnessing this brutality. So I walked away with it knowing that it was extremely heavy, and also I think it has a willingness there. It has a willingness to address these issues in a way that's meant to stay with you in very uncomfortable ways.
Drea, you make, I think, a really insightful point in the comparison with The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And I think one of the context is important, right? The Falcon and the Winter Soldier dealt with racism in the context of a traditional superhero narrative where the good guys win. Whereas Lovecraft Country is dealing with the horror genre. And one of the most marked sort of and most compelling components of Lovecraft Country is the horror that it presents to us is, of course, the traditional Lovecraftian type of horror. But the more horrible aspect of it is racism. And what Lovecraft Country presents to us is racism as horror, which for me, I found a much more compelling narrative. I'm not a huge fan of the horror genre. Nothing against it. It's just not something I have traditionally drawn a lot of meaning from. And yet Lovecraft Country, from the first episode and the sort of showing the greater country what sundown towns were, which I think a lot of Black folks already knew about, to going to the Tulsa race massacre, to sort of what happens when a group of Black people are in a white neighborhood and the police get called. There were horror elements and monsters and magic, and the most horrible component of Lovecraft Country was, in fact, racism. So I'm curious what folks think about the interplay between the horror aspect of Lovecraft Country and the racism, and where they're intersected. For me, there's a Venn diagram that's a perfect circle. But I'm curious what others' thoughts are around racism as horror.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add to Drea's comments too, and that's really great reminder about the juxtaposition of the modern music plus connecting to historical incidents, right, between Emmett Till, the race massacre, laws that were in place that upheld racism, like sundown towns, et cetera, right? And that all those things that are interweaving, I realize almost breaks that fourth wall, because I would assume, I'm going to say my experience, I feel that I probably experienced a sense of dread and fear with the sheriff, right? Following them out of town when they've got 7 minutes to get out of that town, or else they're going to be lynched, because of my lived experiences and my reality and knowledge of the history of sundown towns. I live in Oklahoma. I'm from Tulsa. I get that. I work at a university that was in a historic sundown town in Norman, Oklahoma, and so in reality, I think someone who doesn't understand that history or steeped in it and has kind of this generational kind of connection to it may not understand that dread as much, but it's almost this hope that they're in some ways having some type of simulated experience with the actors and the writing and the way it's played out on camera. And then I hope that we're also, like, for me, I realized that I had more sense of dread with the sundown situation with the sheriff than I did with the Shuggahs, right? Like the monsters that were created to kind of give us that shock. I was startled, and I had fun with that part, but I definitely felt a sense of fear and fright with that element of racism and enforced racism that we know has happened. And in many ways, we had another reality check about how that has occurred, right, in modern day times, when you think about the George Floyds in the world too. So that part and Drea reminded me of that, and I appreciated that too.
When we got our own Black Shuggah, man, it was on. I was like, yes, we have a Shuggah now. But I agree with everything you said, David. I feel like there was a lot of conversation like coming out of all the episodes of Lovecraft Country, but I think like towards the end, everyone was like, wow, like there's so many like really scary monsters like in this show that are like pretty cool, but like terrifying. But like the scariest thing about the show, like the scariest elements in the show is the racism. I think like Christina is like emblematic of like how that can like portray itself. I think the way that she was written was like really thoughtful, and that like you didn't want to trust her at all, but you were like, she's also that girl, like she has a lot of power and she kind of seems like she wants to help them. So I feel like it really got at the nuances of like racism might not be like in your face, like in real life, like you know, it's not like people like, you know, not letting you in somewhere or like tailing you like when you're trying to drive somewhere. It could be someone who like kind of seems to be on your side and is giving you help, but at the end of the day, like when it comes down to it, like she represents, you know, the pervasiveness of like racism and how ultimately like proximity to that like power, in this case like whiteness, upholding white power, like in Christina's case trying to preserve all the magic for them, like ends up getting a couple of our characters killed. And I feel like I wanted to like touch on that really quick when Drea was talking about Ruby, where like she's this amazing, like they talk about the uninterrupted woman. I feel like Ruby really represents that. Like she does her thing in her cute little outfit. She's all about her singing. Like she really embraces herself. But then she gets a taste of what it's like to just not deal with the problems that come with racism because of her blackness, her beautiful blackness, but the world doesn't think that. And it's like, I got to keep going back to this. And then her proximity to Christina and masking herself as a white woman is what ends up being her demise at the end. I think that's kind of metaphorical for like real life. Like you might not actually die, but like you sort of lose a lot of yourself.
You do. And the addiction, I mean, you just lifted up, like she kind of gets almost addicted to the masking. And I think that the shame and guilt that comes from that is real with that exchange, to the degree that she is potentially falling in love with this white woman, who, by the way, is doing her own masking and playing with gender and sexuality in all different ways. I see Christina, Jada, as exactly sort of that symbol. I want to give her more credit and see her as more dimensional, but she is that seduction of, what can I offer you and bring you into this world of privilege and power. And I'll never forget, like when Ruby first transforms into this white woman, my first reaction was like, oh, that's not the white woman I picture when I think about when I transform into a white woman. And my husband was like, what are you talking about? And candidly, this is something that women of color think about. I know as a child, I thought about it all the time. There is, like, white women are protected. I mean, think about this Jim Crow era. They are untouchable, right? And so I think that was, coupled with that realization is also there's the shame and guilt that comes from that, right? Like, what is the self-loathing? What am I internalizing in my world that makes me want these blue eyes, right? And this show, like I said before, gives us that in a way that is confrontational, but I think also in a way that, listening to this conversation means that there was at least an element, a gentleness about it that allowed us to feel okay enough to talk about it.
It's an interesting point you all make, particularly around Ruby. I think of all the things that happened over the course of the weeks the show came on, Ruby's transformation was the one I was most like, hey, what are you, what's going on here? And I do think it was handled very well, but part of my brain was sort of, okay, you can't put the laundry in the street. Like amongst Black folks, like you can't, these are intra community issues that we don't talk about outside of the community. And I found it fascinating, sort of the level to which Lovecraft Country dealt with the things we don't talk about, because part of me was like, can we bar people outside the community from seeing this? Because we're dealing with some stuff here, right? We're dealing with some real deal stuff. And I, particularly when it came to Montrose and his upbringing and the horrors of his childhood, Montrose as a character was the character who I went most often from, I hate this dude, he needs to die, to, oh my God, Montrose never had a chance. This was his life, and this is the horror of his life, every moment of his life. And just the back and forth of understanding that the people we see as horrible and evil had reasons. And that's a very complicated, complex set of circumstances. It's funny, we've talked this much without talking about Tick, who was the quote unquote protagonist, who I hated at least once every episode, particularly when we got to Korea. But at the same time, right, and maybe I hated him so much because I identified with Tick so much, and he would do stuff that I'm like, I don't want to empathize with you, and yet I'm empathizing with you. When we get into that space, I also don't want to end this conversation without talking about some of the more problematic aspects. I'll own that I love Lovecraft Country. And there were things that I believe within the narrative were meant to be problematic. And there were things that I think that were external, were just choices that the producers made that were intensely problematic, that I don't think were intentionally so. So one of the things that I was really struck by when I was watching it, and still very bothered by, is the death of the twin two-spirit person, in its sort of obvious relation to violence against trans folks. Really bothered me, and I don't think I ever really overcome that shock again at the hands of Montrose. And I do think that they were trying to talk about some complex issues around violence within communities. But I'm curious from folks on the call, on the panel, sort of the aspects of Lovecraft Country that you maybe are still struggling with, or areas that you thought were problematic in a way that you haven't quite made your peace with.
Yeah, thanks, Al. I want to address like what you said. I thought you said like things were meant to be problematic, and I was like, oh, technically this is like good writing because the character would do this. Like I think of the confrontation between Montrose and Tick, where like Tick is super homophobic to his dad, where it's like that is very emblematic of the time and what Tick's reaction would be. Did it probably still hurt? Like for especially queer men, as a queer person myself, I was like, ooh, yikes, like that hurt. I also understand why that was put that way, but it was also like, ugh, like it didn't feel great. To talk about the two-spirit character in particular, I have to say, like, I learned a lot from Indigenous communities. Obviously, there's so many, but ones who were willing to voice their concerns online. After that happened, I was like, ooh, that didn't feel good. I think they really tried with representation there in terms of bringing in intersex and Indigenous representation and playing with two-spirit. Something I learned from the Indigenous folks who were speaking up online was like they wouldn't even have the word for two spirits back then. If you're playing with supernatural and that entity is just sort of everlasting, then maybe it could have worked. Like say if that person was from the future, that would have worked. Especially when they just became like a throwaway. I think it would have, if that character was like with us the whole show and like their death was like really, I guess, like sensical over time, I feel like it would have been a lot better, but it still feels a little bit gross in that like, okay, like, yes, Montrose would do that 100%, like was not surprised that he did that, but then maybe don't delve like too much into the character's history and indigeneity if you're just gonna like do that, because it really harmed the community. And I think too, just for like show writers at large, people who are just putting stuff out there with representation, I feel like just really highlighting those voices and paying attention to them and their reactions is super important.
I think those decisions come with a cost. I completely agree that there might have been some intended conflicts and even, you know, even within a family, there were behaviors and hateful things that happened that I believed could have been intentional. And yet I completely agree that Yahima was a character who seemed to be folded in as another horror, that even to present this intersex person as presenting as something that's shocking, that their body was shocking, and then their murder was shocking, you know, being eliminated almost immediately was shocking to us. And I felt that those decisions came with a big price. You know, was it really worth introducing this character when and creating such heavy horror and brutality against them? For us to see, what is it that Montrose also carries demons and is capable of horrible things? Is, you know, what were we supposed to get from that? I did think that there was, if there's anything helpful from it, I don't think there's much, but what could have been helpful is that if we're following Montrose's story, that his queerness was something that he absolutely was horrified with, that he was dealing with that part of his identity, and that this, again, there's this directness and candor about what this was like for these characters in terms of wrestling with race, gender, and sexuality. Where I find few excuses is the character who Tick meets in Korea, Gia, the woman who was possessed by a nine-tailed fox spirit, and then we learn is somebody who is cursed and has to gain her humanity by sleeping with 100 men and killing them. We're with this character for quite some time, and I think the majority of their presentation was about being a predator, about being a sexual sort of seductress, and really playing into that negative Asian stereotype, this dragon lady who unfortunately didn't have a huge arc. Like, again, I ask, like, what was the purpose of sort of presenting her character here? Where I can say that how I can walk away from this and what I'm conceptualizing, or how I'm conceptualizing these relationships, is something that I think we see now, which is that white supremacy continues to be on top because oppressed groups are demonizing one another and, you know, experiencing brutality within our communities and in an intercommunity way that ultimately, of course, as a result of our discriminatory related trauma. And in some ways, when I think about Montrose, is this the only way that you can find retribution? This is the only acceptable way that you can express your sense of hopelessness and of absolute pain. And that's the tragedy of this that I think is one that stays with us.
Yeah, the one thing that comes to mind for me is conversations I have with students oftentimes who are involved in social movement building on our campuses. And we've oftentimes had moments where marginalized communities are then pitted against each other for limited resources, right? Or even see certain elements of either anti-Blackness showing up in certain communities in different ways, or lack of understanding of the experiences of folks in the Asian community who are oftentimes seen as othered and perpetual foreigners and not really cared about, right? I mean, I had droves of people who were marching for George Floyd, and then when I'm with our Asian American students, they're saying, where are the folks for us, right? Where are they marching for us? And one of the things that I did remind them, like, don't kind of get into that trope of trying to harm other marginalized groups, and let's talk through the areas and issues that we have, because I said, if you don't heal what harmed you, you're going to bleed on people who didn't cut you. And I oftentimes try to get them to think just beyond those really just gut reactions. And so when I think about the way the writing was done in Lovecraft Country, that's what it resonated with me, was that idea of, if we don't understand our deep-rooted harm, we're going to end up harming people who weren't actually hurting us, right? And so Montrose's character, not really understanding his internalized homophobia and also his obsession with trying to protect against finding out more information or the truth, basically, and just making these poor decisions. Same with Tick. I mean, the idea of the Korean War, I mean, Black men at that time didn't have a lot of options. A lot of times they went to the military. My dad was one of those people, right? And so when we talk about those contextualized things, when you go to fight for a country that when you come home, you can't even, get a ride after your bus breaks down. I mean, those things coming up, right? The one thing that I had a somewhat different take on what was Gia's character, because in the same way, I think it was really harmful for folks, especially Indigenous folks, watching one character that not get any development, really any major arc, and then is immediately killed in the Two-Spirit character. I found Gia's character very different than what I was used to seeing in terms of imagery of Asian women. And I, being half Korean, I grew up in a household where the idea of sexuality definitely not talked about my Korean mom. And I'm thinking about what I found interesting is sexuality as it played out with the Black female character in Letty, right? I think oftentimes we were watching her and you saw her seemingly as someone who was not taking things seriously, not responsible compared to Ruby, who was selfish, right? And then she surprises Tick and says, "That was my first time," when they had sex, right? And that is different than the typical stereotype and trope about Black women historically, right? We talk about that in terms of assumptions and stereotypes of Black women. Interestingly enough, I found sexuality being part of Gia's character as something in the end that almost became something of obviously a weapon that she was able to use. And I don't think she was fully developed as a character either. I think it was unfair that I wanted her to have some redemption, to not be seen as just someone who was trapped in this kind of this curse. It just sucked about the whole situation with her and Tick, because she loved him, and I think he cared for her too, but he just couldn't get over it. But I just found it very unique and different in the way that they did develop that character. And the one part that I appreciated was when she first was meeting with Tick before they would watch the movie. She got immediately offended because I think that she thought she was being treated as a Korean comfort woman, like a prostitute, and she immediately got offended by that. And that was a nuance that I know not a lot of folks would see or pick up in terms of the history of Korean women during the Korean War. And so that's why actually I did appreciate about her in that moment. She stood up for herself, and she was going to get some type of revenge or redemption until she started actually seeing more about actually Tick's character, just the way we were trying to see him as an audience member, that he was more than just this monster. And in some ways, he was trying to see the same in her.
I was going to quickly say, just in response, she does seem to transcend that stereotype in a way that I think could have been seen as like an interesting arc. So yes, I absolutely agree that there's some opportunity there to kind of see how even in the later episodes, how we learned more about her own family history and heritage and all of the traumas that she had endured within her family, which was something that, they kept out of Yahima's story, right? So I agree that that there may be something there of value.
Yeah, sorry, Al, go ahead.
No, I was just going to sort of mirror what folks have been saying, particularly as it relates to Gia, probably the character I most want to see if there's a second season, some more information about, because that's a story that only got started, in my opinion, and I found it remarkably compelling, and I really wanted to see more. And I have no idea if there's going to be a second season, but I thought that of all the characters, this was the one that had the most potential for like, okay, if we really dig into this person's life, I'm there for it. Drea, I've been doing a lot of reading lately about parasocial relationships, and I'm wondering if you could sort of share with the panel sort of what the nature of parasocial relationships are. And the reason that I think it's interesting in the context of Lovecraft Country is I'm seeing, as people talk, their emotional reaction to it. I will own that I have a more emotional reaction to Lovecraft Country than I have had to anything in a really long time, with the possible exception of Watchmen. And I'm wondering if you could give us a working definition of parasocial relationships and sort of how it's working, particularly in relation to Lovecraft Country.
Yeah, so when I talk about parasocial relationships, especially when I work with students, it's really about understanding the bonds and connections that we have with fictional narrative, and in particular characters that that make us feel visible or make us feel more curious about our identities, and at the very least, mirror our experiences in ways that create meaning and mattering and significance. And like, all of us here on this panel will agree that we grew up not really seeing a lot of ourselves on screen and, in positions and roles that told us we're important, we matter, we make a difference. And so this show, again, if we contextualize when this show dropped, here we are in the throes of this pandemic, during a tremendously painful, traumatic election, enduring separation, detachment from one another in person, in the deep phases of lockdown, finding a sense of healing through these characters. Now, one could say that the horror genre is too brutal to go there. And I do know people who said, like, you know, I had to just kind of put this on hold. This is not for me. On the other hand, the show was able to give us an outlet for extremely personal and painful feelings. And I'm not saying that this is like therapy, you know, what I'm saying is that there are opportunities here for us to process the painful emotions of trauma, of feeling rejected, of feeling isolated, of experiencing brutality, you know, all the things that come with that, and being able to have this visceral connection. And when the characters are dynamic and when we see a complexity to them, which we've noted with these characters here, then it makes a huge difference. We're after the show, after the story, after the show, we're carrying those feelings with us. And I'd even go on to say, you know, as a psychologist, I notice how we then have these like forms of practices with these emotional reactions. If we feel dysregulated, we see how these characters are managing their pain and emotional distress. And as we've noted, some of them do it and like some of them wild out, right? But we feel that way too. So it just kind of invites this sense of, okay, I'm managing this crisis. I'm managing this, you know, interpersonal and social sense of lack of belongingness. But here I can find something that makes sense to me. And I think emotionally that can be really healing.
Yeah, and I know that's one thing we've talked about even in our previous conversations too, about what's healing in watching characters also overcome. I mean, Jada hit on that great point, especially about the women who you know, went through these moments and found a way to survive, found a way to push through. And I just feel like there were so many analogies of that throughout Lovecraft Country that in retrospect are super inspiring. You know, and all the imagery, the one that even the two that pop out to me is one is in the watching us realize that the flames signified something different, right, when they were going through. I think there was a Langston Hughes quote where he says, not light, but fire, right? The idea of redemptive ways in which fire can change and empower and different ways. And so just kind of seeing those moments kind of come through, but, or the notion of even the ways in which the characters find some type of solution or even vengeance, right? When Jada mentioned the Shuggets and us getting Shuggets on our side, or kind of like what that happens. That was the other piece of it too. I thought that because of that attachment and connection to the characters, I also felt a certain satisfaction where you see our characters that we care about somehow survive and push through, right?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like there was so much satisfaction, especially at the end of the series, where it's kind of weird because it's like, oh, the main character is not with us any longer. It was not looking good for him, and we knew he was about to die. But it was also like, oh my God, like look who's left standing. Like that's kind of hopeful. Especially Dee, like Dee at the end, wow, like her coming full circle with her metal arm and her sugar that she has now. That was so like satisfying. Like personally, like it was like you come to the show just coming off like really soon after the episode where you're so frustrated and feel the pain that Dee is going through, especially like growing up as like Black children or just children of color just being dismissed, not taken seriously, and then you see her come back as like this badass, and it's like, well, y'all are gonna pay attention to me now, like I'm like unignorable. And I think too, like Dre, you said the word retribution earlier, and it made me think of like this concept. I think Lovecraft landed so nicely because we didn't really know if our heroes would win at the end. Like the battle was like, okay, they're fighting racism, what the heck? But we had this ending whereas like we kind of finally won on screen. It's in horror called like retribution horror, which I got to give credit to my former professor Tanana Review for introducing these terms to me. where it's like, okay, Black people were not winning in real life. Communities of color being disproportionately affected by the pandemic at the time. Nationally, globally, people are reckoning with anti-Black violence in a way that, like, as in mass, people haven't before. But then we like come to this show and we won at the end. Like, we lost our main character, but like we defeated the evil.
Hold up, you studied under Tananarive Due?
I studied under Tananarive Due. She is like one of my biggest role models. Yeah, I have to give like super proper credit for her, because learning under her, and also Robin Armin's Coleman, her book Horror Noir, and the documentary that they both worked on, really helped frame my viewing of this show. Like, there were so many things where I was like, oh my god, like that's that concept and that's that concept, where I think I really would have loved it anyway, but seeing it through that lens, I was like, oh wow, there's so much to unpack here.
Oh, that's super dope. Sorry. Oh, you're muted, Al. He must be on the phone or not. I don't know.
You're still muted, Al.
Al, you're muted.
I'm going to get a t-shirt that says, Al, you're muted. I want to thank everyone on the panel. We are going to have to wrap it up here. This has been such a rich conversation. And I think, Jada, your last point is what I'm going to leave with. You leave our panels with book recommendations. So thank you all for your time. Just a reminder to anyone who's watching the panel, be careful what diner you stop in a small town. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks, Al.